Chapter 28 Freemasonry and the Crusades. In all the legendary history of Freemasonry, there is nothing more interesting or more romantic than the stories which connect its origin with the Crusades. Nothing in which the judgment and reasoning powers have been more completely surrendered to the imagination of the inventors of the various theories on this subject or to the credulity of the believers. Before proceeding to discuss the numerous phases which have been given by different writers to the theory which traces the origin of Freemasonry to the Crusades, to the chivalric orders of the Middle Ages, and especially to the Knights Templars, it will be proper to take a very brief view of those contests between the Christians and the Saracens which, under the name of the Crusades, cost Europe so vast an amount of blood and treasure in the unsuccessful attempt to secure and maintain possession of the Holy Land. This view, or rather synopsis, need not be more than a brief one, for the topic has been frequently and copiously treated by numerous historians, from Joinville to Michaud and Mills, and must therefore be familiar to most readers. About 20 years after the Moslems had conquered Jerusalem, a recluse of Picardy in France had paid a pious visit to the city. Indignant at the oppressions to which the Christians were subjected in their pious pilgrimages to the sepulchre of their Lord, and moved by the complaints of the aged patriarch, Peter the Hermit, for such is the name that he bears in history, resolved on his return to Europe to attempt to rouse the religious sentiment and the military spirit of the sovereigns, the nobles, and populace of the West. Having first obtained the sanction of the Roman pontiff, Peter the Hermit traveled through Italy and France, and by fervent addresses in every place that he visited, urged his auditors to the sacred duty of rescuing Palestine from the hands of infidels. The superstitious feelings of a priest-governed people and the military spirit of knights accustomed to adventure were readily awakened by the eloquence of a fanatical preacher. In every city and village, in the churches and on the highways, his voice proclaimed the wrongs and the sufferings of pious pilgrims, and his reproaches awoke the remorse of his hearers for their past supineness and indifference to the cause of their brethren, and stimulated their eagerness to rescue the sacred shrines from the pollution of their Saracen possessors. The spirit of enthusiasm which pervaded all classes of the people, nobles and priests, princes and peasants, presented a wonderful scene, which the history of the world had never before and has never since recorded. With one voice, war was declared by the nations of Western Europe against the sacrilegious Moslems. Tradesmen and mechanics abandoned the pursuits by which they were accustomed to gain their livelihood, to take up arms in a holy cause. Peasants and husbandmen left their fields, their flocks, and their herds, and barons alienated or mortgaged their estates to find the means of joining the expedition. The numerous conflicts that followed for the space of 200 years were called the Crusades, or in French, Croisades, from the blood-red cross worn by the warriors on the breast or shoulder, first bestowed at the Council of Clermont by Pope Urban on the Bishop of Puy, and ever afterward worn by every crusader as a badge of his profession. The first detachment of the great army destined for a holy war issued in the year 1096 from the western frontiers. It consisted of nearly 300,000 men, composed for the most part of the lowest orders of society, and was headed by Peter the Hermit. It was, however, a huge, undisciplined mob, rather than an army, whose leader was entirely without military capacity to govern it or to restrain its turbulence. The march, or rather the progress of this immense rabble toward Asia Minor, was marked at every step by crime. They destroyed the towns and plundered the inhabitants of every province through which they roamed in undisciplined confusion. The outraged inhabitants opposed their passage with arms. In many conflicts in Hungary and in Bulgaria, they were slaughtered by thousands. Peter the Hermit escaped to the mountains, and of his deluded and debased followers, but few reached Constantinople, and still fewer the shores of Asia Minor. They were speedily destroyed by the forces of the Sultan. The War of the Crusades had not fairly begun before 300,000 lives were lost in the advance guard of the army. The first crusade was undertaken in the same year, and speedily followed the advanced body whose disastrous fate had just been recorded. This body was composed of many of the most distinguished barons and knights, who were accompanied by their feudal retainers. At the head of this more disciplined army, consisting of 100,000 knights and horsemen and 5 times that number of foot soldiers, was the renowned Godfrey of Bouillon, a nobleman distinguished for his piety, his valor, and his military skill. This army, although unwieldy from its vast numbers, and scarcely manageable from the diverse elements of different nations of which it was composed, was, notwithstanding many reverses, more fortunate and more successful than the rabble under Peter the Hermit, which had preceded it. It reached Palestine in safety, though not without a large diminution of knights and soldiers. At length, Jerusalem, after a siege of 5 weeks, was conquered by the Christian warriors in the year 1099, and Godfrey was declared the first Christian king of Jerusalem. In a pardonable excess of humility, he refused to accept a crown of gems in the place where his lord and master had worn a crown of thorns, and contented himself with the titles of Duke and Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. In the course of the next 25 years, Palestine had become the home, or at least the dwelling place, of much of the chivalry of Europe. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had extended eastward from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the deserts of Arabia, and southward from the city of Berytus, now Beirut, in Syria, to the frontiers of Egypt, besides the country of Tripoli, which stretched north of Berytus to the borders of the Principality of Antioch. The Second Crusade, instigated by the preaching of the monk Saint Bernard and promoted by Louis VII of France, was undertaken in the year 1147. The number of knights, soldiers, priests, women, and camp followers who were engaged in this Second Crusade has been estimated as approaching 1,000,000. At its head were the Emperor Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France. This effort to relieve and to strengthen the decaying Christian power in Palestine was not a successful one. After a futile and inglorious attempt to take the city of Damascus, whose near vicinity to Jerusalem was considered dangerous to the Latin kingdom, Louis returned home with the small remnant of his army in 1149 and was followed in the succeeding year by the Emperor Conrad. Thus ended abortively the Second Crusade, and the Christian cause in Palestine was left to be defended by the feeble forces but invincible courage of the Christian inhabitants. The next 35 or 40 years is a sad and continuous record of the reverses of the Christians. They had to contend with a new and powerful adversary in the person of the renowned Saracen Salahadin, better known as Saladin, who, after 16 years of warfare with the Christian knights, in which he was sometimes defeated, but oftener a victor, succeeded in taking Jerusalem on the 2nd of October in the year 1187. Thus, after a possession by the Christians of 88 years, the city of Jerusalem and the holy shrine which it contained fell again into the power of the Muslims. When the tidings of its fall reached Europe, the greatest sorrow and consternation prevailed. It was at once determined to make a vigorous effort for its rescue from its infidel conquerors. The enthusiasm of the people for its recovery was scarcely less than that which had preceded the First and Second Crusades under the eloquent appeals of Peter the Hermit and Saint Bernard. The principal sovereigns of Europe, Spain alone excepted, which was engaged in its own struggles for the extirpation of the Moors, resolved to lead the armies of their respective nations to the reconquest of Jerusalem. Thus was inaugurated the Third Crusade.